A millionaire, desperate to save his empire, hires a struggling chef from the other side of town to play the role of his fiancée. What starts as a calculated business deal quickly spirals into a web of secrets, sacrifices, and unexpected emotions. But when the truth is exposed, will their fragile bond survive? Or will it all come crashing down? Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Naima Darrow wiped her brow as the sizzling sound of oil hitting the skillet filled the small kitchen of the diner. The aroma of fried chicken and seasoned vegetables wafted through the air. But for her, the smell was nothing more than another marker of the long, grueling shift she'd been pulling for weeks. The walls of the diner were old but comforting, lined with pictures of smiling families and handwritten thank you notes from regulars who appreciated a good meal at a fair price. She glanced at the clock, 11:45 p.m. Almost closing time, yet her work was far from over. Her mother's hospital bills sat heavy in her mind, a stack of papers that seemed to grow taller no matter how much she paid each week. "Naima, another order of the special," the waitress called from the front. "Got it," Naima replied, her voice steady, though her heart felt like sinking. This was her life, working double shifts, smiling for tips, and barely scraping by to provide for the one person she loved more than anything, her mother. The ache of exhaustion was a constant companion, but her resolve never wavered. Meanwhile, in the towering skyscraper overlooking downtown Detroit, Cassian Holloway sat in his expansive corner office, bathed in the cold glow of city lights. The man exuded power. His tailored suit was immaculate, his dark hair combed with precision, and his steel-gray eyes radiated an intensity that had made him a titan in the corporate world. But tonight, those eyes were clouded with frustration as he leaned back in his leather chair, listening to the voice of the company's head investor over the speakerphone. "Cassian, your numbers are solid, but your image is lacking. The board values family values, and frankly, your perpetual bachelor status is making them uneasy. You need to fix this if you want to secure the merger." Cassian clenched his jaw. He hated being told what to do, but he couldn't ignore the truth. In his world, perception often outweighed reality. "Understood," he replied curtly, ending the call. Moments later, his assistant, Miles, entered the room with a confident knock. "Mr. Holloway, I've found someone who might be able to help with your situation," Miles said, handing him a file. Cassian raised an eyebrow as he opened it. Inside were pictures of a young woman. Her name, Naima Darrow, stood out. There was a raw authenticity in her eyes, a warmth that was the complete opposite of his cold, calculated demeanor. "She's a chef?" Cassian asked, his tone skeptical. "A chef who works 2 jobs to support her ailing mother," Miles explained. "She's not from your world, but that's the point. She's real, exactly what you need." Cassian closed the file, his mind already formulating a plan. "Set up a meeting." The next evening, Naima was scrubbing down the kitchen counters, the rhythmic sound of running water and clinking utensils filling the quiet as the closing shift wound down. The familiar sense of fried food and coffee lingered in the air, and the flickering neon sign outside cast a faint glow across the worn tiles. She rolled her shoulders, trying to ease the ache from a long day of work. A sleek black car pulled into the parking lot, its polished exterior a stark contrast to the modest surroundings. Naima noticed it immediately. It wasn't the kind of car that frequented her corner of Detroit. She watched as a man stepped out, tall and composed, his tailored coat catching the soft light. "Naima Darrow?" a smooth, commanding voice called. She froze for a moment before straightening up, gripping the edge of a nearby table. The man walked in with a presence that filled the room. Cassian Holloway. He looked out of place, yet entirely self-assured, like someone who could belong anywhere he chose. "Yes," she replied cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's me. I'm Cassian Holloway," he said, stepping closer. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Naima raised an eyebrow. "You couldn't have called." Cassian smirked faintly. "I prefer face-to-face discussions for matters like these. May we sit?" He motioned to one of the corner booths, and Naima hesitated before nodding. She untied her apron, draping it over a chair as she joined him. The diner felt suddenly smaller, quieter, as if holding its breath for whatever he was about to say. As they sat, Cassian leaned forward, resting his clasped hands on the table. His steel-gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her uneasy. "I have a proposal for you." Naima folded her arms, leaning back slightly. "I'm listening." "It's a business arrangement," he said, his tone deliberate. "I need someone to play the role of my fiancé." Naima blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "Excuse me?" "My investors value family, stability, and appearances," Cassian explained, his voice calm but firm. "You would attend events with me, play the part convincingly, and in return—" He paused, studying her reaction. "I'll pay you handsomely, enough to cover your mother's medical bills." The air seemed to still around them. Naima's hands tightened on the edge of the table as her heart raced. The offer was absurd, audacious, yet it also felt like a lifeline. "And what exactly do you expect from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in her mind. "Your authenticity," Cassian replied simply. "Be yourself, just in a different setting. I don't need theatrics. I need someone who's believable." Naima narrowed her eyes, trying to gauge the sincerity behind his polished demeanor. She couldn't deny the appeal of his offer. Her mother's face, pale and weary in a hospital bed, flashed through her mind. This could be her way out, her chance to save the one person who mattered most. After a long pause, she asked, "What happens if I say no?" Cassian's expression didn't waver. "Then I'll find someone else. But I doubt anyone else has as much to gain from this arrangement as you do." His words were sharp, cutting through her hesitation. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She lowered her gaze to her hands, her thoughts racing. It was madness, complete insanity, but the weight of her mother's bills tipped the scales. Finally, she looked up, meeting his gaze. "All right, Mr. Holloway, I'll do it." Cassian extended his hand, sealing the deal with a firm shake. "Good, we'll start tomorrow." As he stood to leave, Naima followed him to the door, watching as he stepped into his car. The sleek black vehicle disappeared into the night, leaving her alone under the neon glow of the diner's sign. She wrapped her arms around herself, the crisp Detroit air cutting through her jacket. What had she just agreed to? Looking up at the towering skyline in the distance, she let out a shaky breath. Whatever this was, it was going to change her life. Forever. The next day, Naima found herself sitting in a plush leather booth at one of Detroit's most exclusive restaurants. The atmosphere was elegant, almost intimidating. Soft jazz playing in the background, the dim lighting reflecting off crystal chandeliers. It was the kind of place she had only ever seen in movies, a stark contrast to the noisy, modest diner where she spent her days. Cassian Holloway sat across from her, his posture impeccable. Dressed in a tailored suit, he exuded confidence and control. Yet his demeanor wasn't hostile, just distant, as if he were negotiating a merger rather than proposing a life-changing arrangement. "Before we proceed," Naima began, her voice calm but firm, "I need to set some ground rules." Cassian raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her assertiveness. "Go on." Naima met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "First, you will respect me and my family. This is a business deal, not an opportunity for you to look down on where I come from." His lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, though his tone remained even. "Agreed." "Second," she continued, "I won't be treated like an accessory. If I'm going to do this, I need to understand what's expected of me." Every detail, Cassian nodded slowly. "You'll attend key events with me, charity galas, investor meetings, the occasional family dinner. I'll brief you before each one. Your role is to be convincing but discreet. No unnecessary theatrics." Naima leaned back slightly, assessing him. "And in return, you'll cover my mother's medical bills?" He didn't hesitate. Every last cent. The weight of his words settled heavily in the air. Naima wanted to believe him, but trust didn't come easily, especially when the stakes were this high. "And what about my personal life?" she asked, her voice softening. "Will I still have time for my family?" Cassian's expression shifted, a flicker of something resembling compassion passing through his eyes. "Your obligations to your family come first. I'll work around your schedule as much as possible. For a moment, Naima allowed herself to relax, but only briefly. Fine, she said finally, but there's one more thing. You don't get to dictate who I am. I won't change for you or anyone else. Cassian leaned forward slightly, his tone carrying an edge of sincerity. I wouldn't expect you to. In fact, it's your authenticity that makes this work. Their conversation was interrupted as the waiter approached, placing a bottle of wine on the table. Naima watched as Cassian gave a curt nod of approval, the effortless elegance of his actions further reminding her of how different their worlds were. Once the waiter left, Cassian spoke again. There's one other matter to discuss. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table to her. Naima hesitated before opening it. Inside were details about her life, her job, her mother's health, even the diner where she worked. Her stomach tightened. You've been investigating me, she said, her voice low and sharp. Cassian didn't flinch. I needed to ensure you were the right person for this. It's standard due diligence. Standard due diligence? Naima repeated, her frustration rising. You had no right. I had every right, Cassian interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. This isn't just about you, Naima. My reputation, my company, everything is on the line here. I couldn't afford to take chances. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and unresolved. Naima closed the folder and slid it back toward him, her expression unreadable. You're lucky I need this money, she said finally. Otherwise, I'd be walking out of here right now. Cassian studied her, a glint of respect in his eyes. I'm beginning to think I'm the lucky one. The comment caught her off guard, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. As they finalized the terms of their agreement, Naima couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that she was stepping into something far more complicated than she'd anticipated. By the time the meeting ended, the restaurant was nearly empty. Cassian escorted her to the entrance, his demeanor as composed as ever. Tomorrow evening, he said as a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Be ready. I'll send someone to help you prepare. Naima nodded, stepping out into the crisp night air. As the car disappeared into the distance, she stood alone under the glow of the city lights, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and determination. Naima stood in front of the gilded mirror, her reflection a stranger to her. The deep emerald gown she wore clung perfectly to her figure, its shimmering fabric catching the light in a way that made her look ethereal. Her usually unruly curls were pinned into an elegant updo, and diamond earrings, loaned by Cassian, sparkled against her dark skin. She swallowed hard, clutching the sides of the vanity table. Tonight was her first appearance as Cassian Holloway's fiancée, and the pressure was crushing. She had spent the day rehearsing how to walk, how to speak, even how to hold her champagne flute like she belonged in his world. A gentle knock on the door startled her. Come in, she called softly. It was Cassian, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo that seemed tailor-made for command. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over her. For a brief moment, his typically cold demeanor softened. You look perfect, he said, his voice lower than usual. Naima raised an eyebrow, the compliment catching her off guard. That almost sounded genuine, she teased, though her nerves were evident in her tone. Cassian smirked faintly. Let's hope the investors find me as convincing. He offered her his arm, and though reluctant, she took it. Together they descended the grand staircase of his penthouse and stepped into the sleek black limousine waiting below. The ride to the gala was tense. Naima gazed out the window, her thoughts racing. Cassian's voice broke the silence. Remember what we practiced. Be confident but approachable. Engage with the guests but don't overshare. Naima turned to him, her jaw tightening. I've worked in customer service my whole life. I think I know how to handle people. Cassian raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. Fair enough, he replied. Just don't forget, tonight is about making an impression. They arrived at the gala, an opulent event held in the city's most prestigious venue. The towering glass doors opened to reveal a grand ballroom filled with Detroit's elite. Chandeliers sparkled above, and the hum of polite conversation filled the air. As they entered, all eyes turned to them. Naima's heart raced, but she straightened her back and lifted her chin, determined not to falter. Cassian leaned in, his voice low. "You're doing fine. Just follow my lead." The first hour was a blur. Naima found herself introduced to countless people, investors, philanthropists, socialites, each interaction more polished than the last. Cassian's grip on her waist was firm, a subtle reminder of her role. Yet despite her nerves, she found herself adapting. Her natural warmth and authenticity shone through, drawing people in. At one point, she was approached by an elderly couple who seemed particularly curious about her. "Naima, darling, how did you and Cassian meet?" the woman asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Naima hesitated for a split second before remembering their rehearsed backstory. "It was at a small cafe," she said, her smile genuine. "He came in for a coffee and we just started talking." The couple exchanged a knowing look, clearly charmed. "How lovely," the man said. "It's refreshing to see something real in this world." Cassian, standing beside her, said nothing, but Naima could feel his gaze on her. She didn't dare look at him, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. As the night went on, her confidence grew. She even managed to enjoy herself, until she met Roderick Vale. The man exuded an air of calculated charm, his every move deliberate. His eyes flicked between Naima and Cassian with a predatory curiosity. "So, Miss Darrow," Roderick began, his voice smooth, "tell me, what's it like being engaged to one of the most powerful men in Detroit?" Naima smiled politely, though his tone set her on edge. "It's enlightening," she replied carefully. Roderick chuckled, his gaze lingering on her a moment too long. "I bet it is. And what did you do before meeting Cassian? Surely someone as captivating as you has an interesting story." Cassian stiffened beside her, his grip on her waist tightening. Naima felt her heart quicken, but she held her ground. "I'm a chef," she said simply, "and I still am." Roderick's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "A chef? How fascinating. You must tell me, what dish won over Cassian's heart?" The question hung in the air, laced with mockery. Naima forced a laugh, sensing the trap. "Well, you'd have to ask him. He's always been selective." Cassian finally stepped in, his tone icy. "Roderick, I'm sure you have other guests to entertain." Roderick held up his hands in mock surrender. "Of course. But do let me know if you need anything, Miss Darrow. Anything at all." As he walked away, Naima let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "What was that about?" she whispered. "Don't worry about him," Cassian replied, his voice low but firm. "He's just fishing for something to exploit." The rest of the evening passed without incident, but the tension lingered. As they left the gala, Naima couldn't shake the feeling that Roderick was watching them, his mind already working on his next move. In the car ride home, silence hung heavily between them, broken only by the soft hum of the limousine's engine. Naima stared out of the window, her reflection in the glass looking as tired and uncertain as she felt. The evening had been a whirlwind, faces, questions, and expectations swirling in her mind. Cassian finally shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice quieter than usual. It wasn't his usual curt tone. There was an edge of sincerity that caught her attention. Naima turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Did I?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "I wasn't sure if I was convincing enough for your world." Cassian's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "You were more than convincing. You had them eating out of the palm of your hand." Naima let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "I think you give me too much credit. Half the time I was just trying not to trip over my own feet." "That's exactly why it worked," he replied, leaning slightly forward. "You didn't try to impress them with pretension. You were yourself, and they noticed." Naima studied him for a moment, caught off guard by the hint of admiration in his voice. "And you?" she asked softly. "Did I impress you?" Cassian held her gaze, his gray eyes unreadable. "Let's just say you exceeded my expectations," he said finally, his voice steady but lacking its usual sharpness. Naima couldn't help but smile, though she quickly masked it. "Well, I'm glad I passed the test," she said lightly, though there was an undercurrent of seriousness in her tone. Cassian leaned back against the leather seat, his expression returning to its usual composed demeanor. This wasn't a test, Naima. It was a preview. A preview? She echoed, her smile fading slightly. For what's to come, he said, his tone darker now. Tonight was the easy part. Roderick's interest in you isn't a coincidence, and he doesn't back off easily. You'll need to be ready for more. Naima frowned, her earlier confidence wavering. You're saying he's going to come after me? Cassian's jaw tightened. Not just you, us. He's looking for cracks, for weaknesses, and if he finds any, he won't hesitate to exploit them. Naima looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously playing with the fabric of her dress. I didn't sign up for sabotage and mind games, Cassian. I know, he said, his voice softening, but you handled yourself tonight, and if you keep that up, Roderick won't have a chance. For a moment, the tension between them softened. Naima met his gaze, her determination returning. I'll be ready, she said firmly. Cassian nodded, the faintest glimmer of approval in his eyes. Good. The car fell silent again as the city lights blurred past. Though the conversation had ended, Naima couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just been set on a path she could no longer control. Naima gripped the door handle of the car, her stomach twisting with nerves as the sprawling Holloway estate came into view. The massive mansion, nestled among meticulously landscaped gardens, loomed like a castle, opulent, intimidating, and utterly foreign to her. She had faced judgmental glances and whispered skepticism at the gala, but this was personal. Cassian sat beside her, his demeanor calm as always, though a faint tension in his jaw betrayed his own unease. Anything I should know before we go in? Naima asked, her voice steady despite her apprehension. Cassian glanced at her, his expression unreadable. My family can be difficult. Just be yourself. He hesitated, then added, and don't let my sister get to you. Naima raised an eyebrow. Is she that bad? Cassian sighed, rubbing his temple. Vivienne has strong opinions about who belongs in this family, and who doesn't. Naima exhaled sharply, bracing herself. Noted. The car stopped, and a butler opened the door, ushering them inside. The interior of the estate was even grander than Naima had imagined. Marble floors, towering ceilings, and chandeliers that sparkled like constellations. The faint scent of fresh flowers and expensive polish lingered in the air. A voice broke through the hum of the gathering. Cassian, there you are. A tall, elegant woman with sharp features approached, her heels clicking against the marble. Her designer dress and perfectly styled hair screamed sophistication, but her eyes were cold as they settled on Naima. And this must be your fiancé, Vivienne said, her smile tight. Naima, is it? Yes, Naima replied, extending a hand. It's nice to meet you. Vivienne ignored the gesture, her gaze flicking over Naima's dress with thinly veiled disdain. Interesting choice, she murmured before turning back to Cassian. We need to talk, alone. Cassian's jaw tightened. Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of her. Vivienne's smile wavered, but she recovered quickly. Very well. I was just going to ask, how much are you paying her? The room seemed to go silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Naima's cheeks burned, but she refused to look away. Excuse me, she said, her voice calm but firm. Vivienne tilted her head, feigning innocence. Oh, I didn't mean to offend. I'm just curious how someone like you ended up with someone like my brother. Cassian stepped forward, his tone icy. That's enough, Vivienne. But Naima placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Her gaze remained locked on Vivienne's. I can see why you'd be curious, Naima said, her voice steady. But what matters isn't how we got here. It's that we're here. The simplicity of her response seemed to catch Vivienne off guard. For a moment she looked as though she might argue, but then she simply turned on her heel and walked away. Cassian exhaled, his tension easing slightly. You didn't have to do that, Naima smiled faintly. Yes, I did. You're paying me to play a role, remember? His expression softened, but before he could respond, an older woman approached, a warm, maternal figure with kind eyes. Cassian, darling, she said, pulling him into a hug. Then she turned to Naima, her smile widening. And you must be Naima. Welcome. Naima felt a wave of relief as she shook the woman's hand. Thank you. It's lovely to meet you. I'm Margaret, Cassian's stepmother, she explained. Don't mind Vivian. She's protective in her own unique way. Naima nodded politely, though she suspected there was more to it than that. Still, Margaret's warmth was a welcome reprieve from Vivian's frostiness. As the evening progressed, Naima found herself navigating the maze of introductions and small talk with surprising ease. She met Cassian's father, a stoic man who spoke little but observed everything, and various relatives who ranged from mildly curious to outright skeptical. At one point, Cassian led her to the balcony for a moment of quiet. The cool night air was a welcome escape from the crowded room. You handled Vivian well, he said, leaning against the railing. Most people don't. Naima shrugged, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. I've dealt with worse. People like her don't bother me. Cassian studied her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. You're full of surprises, Naima. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. So are you. Before either of them could say more, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. They turned to see Roderick Vale standing in the doorway, a glass of champagne in hand and a knowing smirk on his face. Beautiful night, isn't it? He said, stepping onto the balcony. His gaze flicked between them, his smile widening. I must say, you two make quite the pair. Cassian's demeanor shifted instantly, his posture stiffening. What do you want, Roderick? Oh, nothing in particular, Roderick replied, swirling his champagne. Just thought I'd congratulate you, Cassian. It's not every day you find someone as unique as Naima. Naima bristled at the subtle insult, but she held her ground. I'll take that as a compliment, she said evenly. Roderick chuckled. Of course, well, I won't keep you. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other. As he walked away, Cassian's expression darkened. Stay away from him, he said, his tone low. Who is he? Naima asked, sensing the tension. A problem, Cassian replied, and one I don't intend to let near you. Naima didn't press further, but the encounter left her unsettled. As they returned to the party, she couldn't shake the feeling that Roderick was far from done with them. Naima stirred the pot of soup in her apartment kitchen, her movements rhythmic but distracted. It had been a week since the tense encounter at the Holloway estate, yet Vivian's veiled insults and Roderick's sly comments lingered in her mind like an unwelcome echo. Cassian, ever the enigma, had been uncharacteristically attentive, ensuring she wasn't left alone at public events where prying eyes could exploit her vulnerability. Still, the uneasy feeling that someone was digging into her life refused to fade. Her phone buzzed on the counter, jolting her from her thoughts. She wiped her hands and picked it up. It was Cassian. Naima, are you free to meet? He asked, his tone clipped, more urgent than usual. I can be, she replied. Is everything okay? There's something I need to tell you. Meet me at my office in an hour. His abruptness sent a chill through her. She nodded even though he couldn't see her. I'll be there. The towering skyscraper that housed Holloway Enterprises felt colder than ever as Naima stepped out of the elevator. Cassian stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in his office, his silhouette stark against the city skyline. You wanted to talk? She said, her voice tentative. He turned to face her, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. You should sit down. Naima's heart sank as she took a seat. What's going on? Cassian crossed the room and handed her a folder. Roderick has been digging into your past. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Inside were documents, her job history, her mother's medical records, even details about her financial struggles. The invasion of privacy was suffocating. How did he get this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He has resources, Cassian replied, and he's not afraid to use them. He plans to use this to discredit me and you. Naima's eyes snapped up to meet his. Discredit me? How? By telling the truth about who I am? Cassian frowned, his frustration evident. It's not about the truth. It's about perception. He'll twist this to make it look like you're taking advantage of me. Or worse, that I'm exploiting you. Naima's anger flared, her voice rising. You mean like you already did? You knew about all of this before I even agreed to this arrangement, didn't you? I had to, Cassian admitted, his tone sharp but not unkind. I couldn't risk bringing someone into this without knowing everything. She stood, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. You didn't know everything. You only saw numbers and facts, but you don't know what it's like to live through it. Her words hung in the air, and for once, Cassian had no response. Naima took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. What does Roderick want? He hasn't made a direct move yet, Cassian said, but he will. And when he does, it won't just hurt me, it'll hurt you, your family. I won't let that happen. Naima scoffed. And how do you plan to stop him? Another business deal? Another lie? Cassian's expression hardened. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Naima. I'm asking for your trust. Her anger softened slightly, but the pain lingered. Trust isn't something you can demand, Cassian. It's something you earn. Later that night, Naima sat alone in her apartment, the folder still sitting on the table. She stared at the documents, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The thought of her mother's illness and the sacrifices she had made to keep their lives afloat burned in her chest. She wasn't ashamed of her past, but the idea of it being used against her was unbearable. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Cassian. I'm sorry, let me fix this. She typed back quickly, her fingers trembling. You can't fix something you broke. Naima set the phone down and buried her face in her hands. For the first time since their agreement, she wondered if this was all a mistake. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the nearby shops. Naima clutched her bag tightly as she approached the diner, her mind still clouded from the restless night. She had barely taken a step toward the entrance when she noticed him. A tall figure leaning against the brick wall, his usual air of control noticeably absent. Cassian. His dark suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, and there was a shadow of stubble on his jawline, as if sleep had eluded him. He straightened when he saw her, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. Cassian, she said, her voice tinged with both surprise and weariness. She stopped a few feet away, her arms instinctively folding across her chest. What are you doing here? I couldn't leave things the way they were, he said simply, his voice low and deliberate. There was no trace of his usual polished detachment, only raw honesty. Naima raised an eyebrow, her expression guarded. And? Cassian ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability that caught her off guard. He stepped closer, though not enough to invade her space. I made a mistake, he began, his voice steady but filled with weight. I don't regret asking for your help. That part was necessary. But I regret not being honest with you from the beginning. Her eyes narrowed slightly and she tilted her head, her tone sharp. Honest about what exactly? He exhaled slowly, as if preparing himself for something that required every ounce of courage he had. About why I chose you. It wasn't just because you're authentic or convincing. It's because... He paused, his gaze unwavering. Because I care about you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and electrifying. Naima blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in his demeanor. Her breath hitched. What are you saying, Cassian? He took another step forward, the gap between them closing just enough to let her feel the warmth of his presence. I'm saying this isn't just business anymore, he admitted, his voice steady despite the raw emotion that flickered in his eyes. I'm saying I care about you more than I expected, more than I should. Naima's arms tightened around herself, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. You care? She repeated, her tone laced with a mix of disbelief and something unspoken. After everything? After keeping secrets and dragging me into this mess? I know, he said softly, his voice almost breaking, and I hate myself for it. I've made this harder for you than it ever should have been, but I can't change the past. What I can do is protect you now, even if it costs me everything else. Naima felt her throat tighten, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Protect me? She whispered. Even if it means walking away? Cassian nodded, his expression resolute. Yes, even if it means walking away. From the deal, from my company, from all of it. None of that matters if it puts you in harm's way. For the first time, Naima saw the man behind the armor. the cracks in his impenetrable exterior, the vulnerability he rarely let anyone glimpse. It was disarming, but it wasn't enough to erase the pain of what had already happened. She shook her head, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can believe you, Cassian. You've lied before. How do I know this isn't just another game? His shoulders sagged slightly, but his gaze didn't waver. You don't, he said simply. I can't ask you to believe me. Not yet. But I can show you. Let me prove it. For a moment the two stood there in the quiet tension of the morning, the bustling world around them fading into the background. Naima searched his face, looking for any hint of insincerity, but all she saw was a man who was finally, desperately, trying to make things right. Without waiting for her response, Cassian turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate. Naima watched him go, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She didn't call him back, but as he disappeared around the corner, she realized that for the first time in her life, she didn't know if she wanted him to stay or to let him go. Her heart ached with the uncertainty, but one thing was clear. The carefully constructed walls between them were beginning to crumble, and she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or something dangerous. Naima's hometown of Detroit felt smaller than ever as she stepped off the bus near her childhood neighborhood. The streets, though familiar, seemed heavier with the weight of her thoughts. The little diner where she once worked stood proudly on the corner, its neon sign buzzing faintly, and the worn streets she'd navigated for years seemed to whisper memories of a simpler life, one she could barely recognize now. She was home, but nothing felt right. Her mother's modest house came into view, the peeling white paint on the siding a reminder of just how much they'd struggled to hold on to it. She climbed the steps, her feet heavy with both dread and relief, and knocked softly before letting herself in. Naima? Her mother's voice, though weak, carried warmth and surprise. Naima stepped into the living room where her mother was seated in her favorite armchair. A crocheted blanket covered her legs and a book rested in her lap. Her face, lined with age and illness, lit up at the sight of her daughter. Hi, Mom, Naima said, dropping her bag by the door and rushing to embrace her. I thought I'd come stay for a bit. Her mother pulled back, her sharp eyes scanning Naima's face. Why do I get the feeling you're running from something? Naima laughed lightly, though it was forced. I just needed to take a break from everything. Her mother patted her hand, her expression softening. Well, you're here now. That's what matters. Later that evening, as Naima busied herself in the kitchen preparing dinner, there was a knock at the door. She frowned, wiping her hands on a towel before making her way to answer it. Standing on the porch was Cassian. Naima froze. He looked out of place in his tailored coat and polished shoes, his presence an undeniable clash against the modest backdrop of her neighborhood. His eyes, however, were softer than she'd ever seen them, filled with something almost resembling humility. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice low but steady. Cassian glanced past her, as if ensuring her mother wasn't within earshot. I wanted to talk, to explain. Naima hesitated, torn between slamming the door and letting him in. Finally, with a sigh, she stepped aside. Come in. Cassian entered cautiously, his gaze briefly sweeping the cozy living room. He noticed the small details, the family photos lining the shelves, the worn but clean furniture that spoke of years of care. It was a stark contrast to his world, yet it felt real. Naima gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, his posture tense. She crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. Well, she prompted. Cassian took a deep breath. I wanted to see this part of your life, to understand what you've been protecting all this time. Naima's eyes narrowed. And what did you expect to find? I don't know, he admitted, but what I see is strength, resilience, everything I lack. His words caught her off guard, softening her defenses, though she didn't let it show. Cassian, you can't just show up here and expect me to forget everything that's happened. I don't expect that, he said quickly, but I need you to know that I see you, Naima, not as someone playing a role or part of a deal, but as the person you really are. Her chest tightened at his words, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Before she could speak, her mother appeared in the doorway, her steps slow but steady. "Who's this?" she asked, her curious gaze shifting between them. Naima hesitated. "Mom, this is Cassian." Her mother's brow lifted. "Cassian Holloway? The one I've been hearing about?" Naima's cheeks flushed. "Yeah, that Cassian." Cassian stepped forward, extending a hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Darrow." Her mother shook his hand firmly, a small smile playing on her lips. "Well, you've got some nerve showing up here." "Mom!" Naima exclaimed, mortified, but Cassian only smiled faintly. "I suppose I do." Her mother studied him for a moment, her sharp gaze unrelenting. Finally, she said, "Come sit. I'd like to talk to you." Naima opened her mouth to protest, but her mother shot her a look that silenced her. Reluctantly, she stepped back as Cassian followed her mother into the living room. They spoke for nearly an hour, Naima hovering near the kitchen, too anxious to eavesdrop but unable to ignore their conversation entirely. When Cassian finally emerged, his expression was thoughtful, almost introspective. "What did she say to you?" Naima asked as she walked him to the door. Cassian paused, his hand resting on the doorknob. "She told me that you've spent your whole life putting everyone else first, and that if I want to be part of your life, I need to prove that I'm worthy of it." Naima's breath caught at the weight of his words. "And what do you think?" "I think she's right," he said quietly, "and I intend to." With that, he stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against them both. He turned back to her, his gaze steady. "I'm not giving up, Naima. Not on you. Not on us." She didn't reply, her emotions too tangled to form words. As Cassian walked away into the night, Naima closed the door, leaning against it as tears welled in her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The sharp ring of Naima's phone cut through the quiet of the afternoon. She hesitated before answering, the name on the screen sending a chill down her spine. Roderick Vale. She hadn't given him her number, but she wasn't surprised that he had managed to find it. People like Roderick always had ways to get what they wanted. "Miss Darrow," his smooth, calculated voice came through the line. "I trust this isn't a bad time." Naima gripped the phone tighter, forcing her voice to stay steady. "What do you want, Roderick?" "Straight to the point." "I like that," he said with a chuckle. "Let's just say I have a proposition for you, something that could benefit us both." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not interested." "You haven't even heard what I have to say," he countered, his tone patronizing. "I know you care about your family, about keeping them safe. And I know Cassian has dragged you into a situation far more dangerous than you realize." Naima's heart raced, but she kept her tone firm. "What's your point?" "My point, Miss Darrow, is that Cassian isn't who you think he is. He's a man who will sacrifice anyone to protect his empire, including you." Naima's stomach twisted, but she refused to show any weakness. "You don't know anything about me or Cassian." "Don't I?" Roderick said, his voice turning cold. "Here's the deal. You help me expose the truth about Cassian, his lies, his manipulations, and I'll ensure your family is taken care of. Financial security, no more hospital bills, no more struggling." Naima's breath hitched. It was everything she had ever wanted for her mother, a life free of constant worry. But the thought of betraying Cassian, of being used as a pawn in Roderick's schemes, made her stomach churn. "I'm not interested," she said again, her voice firmer this time. "Think carefully, Miss Darrow," Roderick warned. "Loyalty is a dangerous game, especially when the person you're loyal to doesn't deserve it. Call me when you're ready to make the smart choice." The line went dead, leaving Naima staring at the phone in her hand, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. She sat in the small living room, staring at the stack of medical bills on the coffee table. The weight of her choices pressed heavily on her chest. Roderick's proposition lingered in her mind, like poison slowly spreading through her thoughts. She hated him for exploiting her family's vulnerability, but even more, she hated the kernel of doubt he had planted about Cassian. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from her spiral of thoughts. She hesitated before opening it, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Vivian Holloway standing there, her face as sharp and unyielding as ever. "Vivian?" Naima asked, confused. "What are you doing here?" Vivian stepped inside without invitation, her heels clicking against the worn floor. Her gaze swept over the modest room, a faint sneer curling her lips. I thought we should talk. Naima closed the door behind her, her jaw tightening. About what? Roderick, Vivian said simply, her tone clipped. He's been sniffing around more than usual, and I have a feeling you know why. Naima's breath caught. What are you talking about? Vivian folded her arms, leaning against the wall with a calculating expression. He's making moves against Cassian, using you as leverage. He's already spread rumors among the investors, and it's only a matter of time before he takes this public. Whatever he's offering you, it's not worth the damage he'll cause. Naima felt a surge of anger. You think I'm working with him? I think you're in over your head, Vivian replied coldly. And I think Roderick knows exactly how to exploit someone like you. Naima's hands clenched into fists, but before she could respond, Vivian softened, just slightly. Look, I don't trust you, but I trust my brother even less when it comes to protecting himself. Cassian doesn't know how to handle this kind of threat. He's too focused on controlling everything. If you care about him at all, you need to tell him what's going on. Naima's anger faltered as Vivian's words sank in. Why do you care? Vivian's eyes darkened. Because if Roderick succeeds, it won't just ruin Cassian, it'll tear this family apart. I won't let that happen. With that, Vivian turned and walked out, leaving Naima standing in stunned silence. The next morning, Naima arrived at Cassian's office unannounced, the tension in her chest building with every step. The receptionist tried to stop her, but she pushed past, bursting into his office where he stood by the window, his phone in hand. Naima, Cassian said, startled. What's going on? She shut the door behind her, her voice shaking with urgency. Roderick, he's planning something big. Vivian came to see me last night. She said he's spreading rumors and trying to turn your investors against you. Cassian's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. What else did she say? She thinks he's going to escalate, Naima continued. He's going to expose everything. The deal, our arrangement, everything. Cassian cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. I knew he wouldn't back off, but this... Naima took a step closer, her voice firm. You need to call a meeting. Get ahead of him before he can do any more damage. Cassian looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and gratitude. You're right. It's time to take control of this. He picked up his phone, dialing quickly. Get the board together. I want every major investor in the room by tomorrow morning. As he ended the call, he turned back to Naima. Thank you for telling me. She nodded, the tension between them momentarily easing. Just don't make me regret it. Cassian's expression softened. You won't. But as Naima left his office, her stomach churned with uncertainty. The stage was set for the confrontation to come, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Roderick still had more cards to play. The conference hall buzzed with murmurs as some of the most powerful names in Detroit's business world gathered. The atmosphere was tense, the air electric with anticipation. Cassian stood at the head of the room, his suit as impeccable as always. But there was a weight to his expression, a vulnerability that even his usual composure couldn't mask. Naima stood at the back, her heart pounding as she watched him. She had made her decision, but the uncertainty of what would happen next gripped her like a vice. Cassian hadn't seen her yet, and for now, she preferred it that way. She needed a moment to steel herself for what was to come. Ladies and gentlemen, Cassian began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. Thank you for being here today. Before we proceed with the business agenda, there is something I must address. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. For years, Cassian continued, I have built my reputation on the foundation of strength, strategy, and success. But I've realized that foundation was incomplete. It was missing honesty. He paused, glancing briefly at Naima, as if drawing strength from her presence. Recently, I entered into an arrangement that some might consider unconventional. I asked someone to help me present an image of stability to secure a critical deal. That person is Naima Darrow. A ripple of whispers spread through the room, a mix of surprise and judgment. She agreed to help me because of her own reasons that had nothing to do with deceit or manipulation. but everything to do with protecting her family. What started as a calculated move on my part became something much more real. Cassian's voice softened, his gaze unwavering as he addressed the crowd. Naima showed me what it means to fight for something greater than yourself. She reminded me of the values I had long forgotten: integrity, compassion, and the courage to admit when you've been wrong. Before he could continue, the doors at the back of the hall swung open. Roderick Vale strode in, his smile sharp as a knife. In his hand, he carried a folder, one Naima recognized all too well. "Touching speech, Cassian," Roderick said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "But I think you're leaving out a few key details." Cassian's jaw tightened. "Roderick, this isn't the time." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time," Roderick countered, turning to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me fill in the gaps for you. Cassian's so-called fiancée isn't what she appears to be. She's a struggling chef from the wrong side of town with a family drowning in debt. And their relationship? It's a lie. A business deal, pure and simple." The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs, the atmosphere growing more charged by the second. Naima felt her chest tighten, but before she could react, Cassian spoke. "You're right, Roderick," he said, his tone even. "Our relationship started as an arrangement. But unlike you, I've learned that honesty is worth far more than any business deal." Roderick's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, please. Do you really think they'll believe that? This is nothing more than a last-ditch effort to save face." Naima stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Then let them hear it from me." The room turned to her as she walked to the front, her head held high. She felt the weight of every gaze, but she refused to falter. "What Roderick said is true, at least partly," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Cassian and I started this as a deal. I agreed to play a role because I needed the money to help my family. But what he didn't tell you is that he was willing to give it all up. For me." Her eyes met Cassian's, a mixture of pain and resolve. "He showed me that even in a world built on appearances and power, there's room for something genuine. He made mistakes, so did I. But we both learned that the truth matters more than anything else." The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, an older man near the front, a respected investor, stood. "I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's lying," he said, his voice firm. "And from what I've seen today, Cassian and Naima are the most honest people in this room." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd, the tide slowly turning in their favor. Roderick's smug expression crumbled as he realized his plan had backfired. Cassian stepped forward, his voice filled with quiet strength. "This isn't just about saving a deal. It's about rebuilding something better, something that reflects the values we claim to stand for. And if that's not enough for you, then I don't want your investment." The room erupted into applause, the tension breaking like a dam. Naima felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was mixed with the realization that this was just the beginning. As the crowd dispersed, Cassian approached her, his expression soft. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "For both of us." Roderick, now cornered, glared at them before storming out of the hall. His exit was met with whispers of disdain, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. Cassian turned to Naima, his voice low but full of conviction. "We did this together, and I'm not going to let you go, Naima. Not now, not ever." For the first time, she let herself believe him. Naima stood in the middle of the small, bustling restaurant, her hands clasped in front of her apron as she watched the waitstaff move with precision. The air smelled of roasted garlic and fresh herbs, mingling with the faint hum of conversation and laughter from the diners. The space wasn't large, but it was warm, inviting, a reflection of everything she had dreamed of. Her restaurant, her home, a place she had built with love, sweat, and a lot of help from Cassian. She adjusted a vase of fresh flowers on the counter, a quiet smile playing on her lips. This was what she had worked so hard for, not just to survive, but to thrive. The journey hadn't been easy, but every step had been worth it. The chime of the front doorbell pulled her attention, and she looked up to see Cassian walking in, his tailored coat open over a casual sweater. He looked out of place among the cozy, humble surroundings, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes found hers immediately, and his lips curved into a soft smile. "How's the first week going?" he asked, leaning on the counter. "Busy," Naima replied, brushing a stray curl from her face, "but in the best way possible." Cassian nodded, his gaze scanning the room before returning to her. "You've done something incredible here, Naima. It's inspiring." She chuckled, leaning on the counter to match his stance. "I don't know about that. It's just a restaurant." "No," he said firmly, his voice low and sincere. "It's a dream come true, and you made it happen." Her heart warmed at his words, and for a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded into the background. Cassian had changed since they first met. He wasn't just the cold, calculating businessman anymore. He was something more, something better, and she knew she had changed too. "Well, I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted, her voice soft. Cassian shook his head. "You could have, but I'm glad I could help." Before she could respond, her assistant chef called her name, pulling her back to the reality of the busy evening. "I'll be right back," she said, giving Cassian an apologetic smile. He watched her walk away, his expression thoughtful. As she disappeared into the kitchen, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. He opened it briefly, the sparkle of the ring catching the light, before closing it again and slipping it back into his pocket. Later that night, as the last of the customers left and the clatter of dishes faded into the background, Cassian waited by the door. His hands were tucked into his coat pockets, his posture relaxed yet purposeful. When Naima finally approached, her face still glowing from the excitement of the evening, his breath caught. "You didn't have to wait for me," she said, pulling her scarf around her neck. Her voice was light, but her eyes lingered on him, curious. "I wanted to," he replied softly. "There's something about walking you home that feels right." Naima raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a small smile. "Well, that's a first. Mr. Holloway doing something just because it feels right." Cassian smirked but didn't take the bait. "Walk with me?" Her smile softened and she nodded. Together they stepped into the cool night, the faint hum of the city surrounding them like a melody. The streets were quieter than usual, the faint glow of streetlights creating pockets of warmth against the darkness. For a while neither of them spoke, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that held unspoken words, waiting for the right moment to surface. Eventually they reached a small park, its benches dusted with fallen leaves and its fountain glistening under the moonlight. Cassian stopped, his gaze fixed on the fountain for a moment before he turned to face her. "Naima," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About how we started. And how far we've come." She tilted her head, her brows furrowing slightly. "Cassian, what's going on? You're starting to worry me." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried the weight of 1,000 emotions. "I need you to hear this," he said, stepping closer. "When we met, I was so focused on the deal, on protecting my company and my image, that I didn't see what was right in front of me." Naima's breath caught. "And what was that?" "You," he said simply, his gray eyes locked onto hers. "You changed everything, Naima. You made me see the world differently. You made me want to be different." Her chest tightened, her heart hammering as his words sank in. "Cassian, you don't have to say this." "Yes, I do," he insisted, his voice growing stronger. "You've taught me what it means to care about something, someone, more than myself. You've shown me a kind of strength I didn't even know existed." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she whispered, "Cassian, why are you telling me this now?" He took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Slowly he lowered himself to one knee, his gaze never leaving hers. "Because I don't want to waste another second," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Naima Darrow, you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. I love you, not because of some deal or plan, but because of who you are. Will you marry me?" Naima's hands flew to her mouth as a tear slipped down her cheek. The sincerity in his voice, the raw emotion in his eyes. It was more than she could have ever imagined. You, you really mean that? She asked, her voice trembling. This isn't just about making things right? Cassian shook his head. This is about starting something right, together. For a moment she couldn't speak, her emotions a storm inside her. But as she looked at him, this man who had broken down his own walls to stand before her, vulnerable and open, she knew her answer. Yes, she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Yes, Cassian, I'll marry you. A smile broke across his face, the kind of smile that lit up his entire being. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands warm and steady. Then he stood, pulling her into his arms. Naima buried her face in his chest, the tears flowing freely now. You have no idea how long I've waited to feel this, she murmured. Cassian pressed his lips to her hair, his voice low and full of promise. Then let me make sure you never have to wait again. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms under the glow of the city lights, Naima felt a peace she had never known. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was living, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of Naima's restaurant, casting a warm glow over the carefully arranged tables. But today, the space looked different. The chairs were adorned with white satin ribbons, and the tables were covered with crisp linens and delicate floral arrangements. The scent of roses and lavender mingled with the faint aroma of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchen. Naima stood in front of the mirror in her small office, her reflection almost unrecognizable. Her wedding dress was simple yet elegant, a soft ivory gown that hugged her figure before cascading into a flowing train. Her curls were pinned back with small pearls, and her makeup was understated, highlighting her natural beauty. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, her voice steady but her heart racing. Lily stepped inside, her face beaming with excitement. Her younger sister looked radiant in her lavender bridesmaid dress, her smile brighter than ever. "You look incredible," Lily said, her voice filled with awe. Naima turned to her sister, her expression softening. "You think so?" "I know so," Lily replied, walking over to adjust the train of Naima's dress. "Mom would be so proud of you, Naima. She'd love this." Naima's throat tightened, but she nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. Her mother's absence was a bittersweet ache in her chest, but she felt her presence in every detail of the day. There was another knock, this one firmer. Cassian's voice came through the door. "Naima, can I come in?" Lily smirked and stepped back. "I'll leave you two alone." Naima turned as Cassian entered, looking impossibly handsome in his tailored black tuxedo. His gray eyes softened the moment they met hers. "Wow," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're breathtaking." Naima laughed softly, smoothing the front of her dress. "You clean up pretty well yourself." He stepped closer, his hands finding hers. "Are you ready?" She nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "I am." The ceremony was held in the courtyard behind the restaurant, a charming space decorated with string lights and lush greenery. Their closest friends and family gathered under the soft glow of the afternoon sun, the air filled with the gentle hum of joy and anticipation. As Naima walked down the aisle, every step felt like a culmination of her journey. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt had led her to this. And at the end of the aisle, Cassian waited, his eyes locked on hers, a mixture of love and awe on his face. The officiant's voice was steady as they exchanged vows, but for Naima and Cassian, the world seemed to fade away. They spoke from their hearts, their words carrying the weight of everything they had been through and the promises they were making for the future. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, Cassian leaned in, his kiss tender but full of passion. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound carrying across the courtyard like a wave of celebration. The reception was lively and full of laughter. Naima's restaurant had never been so alive, the air buzzing with the joy of new beginnings. Guests danced, toasted, and shared stories, their voices blending into a harmonious symphony of love and community. At one point, Cassian led Naima outside to the quiet street under the twinkling city lights. He held her close, his hands warm against her back. "Do you remember the first time I brought you to a place like this?" he asked, his voice soft. She nodded, smiling at the memory. "I felt completely out of place. And now?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Now I feel like I belong," she said, her voice steady, "because I'm with you." Cassian smiled, his gray eyes shimmering with emotion. "And I'm with you, Naima. Always." They stood there for a moment, the city humming quietly around them. For the first time, both of them felt a peace they had never known, a sense of home they had finally found in each other. As the evening wound down, Naima and Cassian stood together in front of a new building, the ribbon still tied across its entrance. The sign above read, "The Darrow Holloway Center for Community Growth." Cassian held the ribbon-cutting scissors, but he paused, handing them to Naima. "This is your moment." Naima smiled, the weight of what they had accomplished settling over her. She cut the ribbon, the sound of applause breaking the quiet of the night. The center was a symbol of everything they had overcome and everything they hoped to build. A future rooted in honesty, love, and the strength of community. As they stood together, surrounded by friends and family, Cassian whispered, "This is just the beginning." Naima leaned into him, her heart full. "And I can't wait to see what's next." As the lights dim on Naima and Cassian's journey, we're left with a story of transformation. Proof that sometimes the most unexpected connections can teach us the most profound lessons. Their path reminds us that honesty and vulnerability, though difficult, can pave the way for deeper trust and lasting love. This story raises questions about the balance between ambition and authenticity, as well as the lengths we go to for those we care about. It challenges us to consider, what would you do if faced with choices like Naima's? Would you risk your heart and principles for the chance to help your family or protect someone you love? And what about Cassian's transformation? From a man of calculated logic to someone willing to risk it all for love, does his journey resonate with you? Have you ever found yourself redefining what truly matters? Let's talk about it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters, and I'd love to hear how this story connects to your own experiences. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are more stories just like this one waiting to be told. Stories of love, redemption, and the human spirit. Hit that subscribe button and join me for the next chapter in this ongoing journey. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.